This is the Demystifying Mental Toughness Podcast, hosted by David Charlton, and you're listening to this podcast to help you build your own mental toughness, so that you can support other people or your clients better. Either way, you will learn more about developing this plastic personality trait that all but guarantees that you will perform better and lead a more prosperous life. Welcome back to the Demystifying Mental Toughness Podcast with your host, David Charlton. And in today's episode, we're going to focus on an approach to helping people, which is called positive psychology. And this focuses on understanding and promoting well-being, happiness, and positive aspects of human functioning. It's a relatively new angle, a solution-focused approach, which isn't the typical problem-solving, problem-focused approach of traditional psychology. And in my conversation with positive psychology advocate Lisa Avery, we go on to discuss a measure of mental toughness, which is life control. And this links to having a can-do attitude towards life, especially when we're faced with challenges. We discuss identifying and cultivating positive emotions, character strengths and virtues that go on to contribute towards a feel-good factor and overcoming our negativity bias. I really hope you enjoy this episode. Hi Lisa, it's lovely to meet you today. Would you be able to share with the listeners a little bit about your background and your interest in positive psychology?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, David. Really appreciate this opportunity. So I'm Lisa, and my background is in positive psychology, which is the branch of psychology which deals with optimal human functioning, really simply how to live your best life. So I've got a master's in positive psychology and coaching psychology, and these two things work really well together. Positive psychology, it's the science, it's the research, and the coaching, really, it's the practical skills and tools to help people reach their own peak potential, I guess, and live their best lives through a series of powerful questions. And I love a good question.
So what got you interested in positive psychology?
Great question. It was kind of serendipitous, I have to say. I'd always been really interested in psychology. I can remember in the late 90s, I think it was Daniel Goleman's book on emotional intelligence. And I just remember being struck by the fact that there was more than one way to be intelligent in this life. And the emotional part, that was something that in the late 90s, people weren't really talking about how you felt, I don't know about you, David, but at school, no single teacher ever asked me, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Can you relate to that?
Yeah, I certainly can. It was more of a control, right? You're doing this, you're doing that. Simple as that.
Absolutely. No sort of real interest in a person's psychology, which I find insane, that you go to school, you're taught a massive range of subjects, but nobody ever teaches you about the filter through which you will process all that information, which is your own mind. So coming back to your question, at the time, so I'd always had this interest that I'd never really done anything formally about. And then around 15 years ago, I was working in Barcelona. I was teaching English at the School of Psychology. And at that moment, they were organizing the first International Congress of Coaching Psychology. So little did I know, I'd been invited to interpret between all these really cool kind of key players in the field that I knew nothing about. So I was just young and up for it. And I went and I did this interpretation at the conference. And it was the first time in my life that I really felt, oh my word, this is my world. How can I get into it? What can I do? Is it too late? And unfortunately for me, it wasn't too late. So a couple of years later, that's when I enrolled for the 3-year master's. And I have to say, personally and professionally, it changed everything about my life, but just everything. So that's how powerful I believe this subject is when it lands at the right time being when you're receptive to this kind of content, I think.
And now with your coaching work there, you work a lot with children, don't you? Especially from like a deprived background and difficult upbringings. What got you interested in that specific area?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. Yes, I would work with a lot of young people, perhaps rather than children, young people between the ages of 16 and 24. I guess because my own journey meant that I didn't really have very much confidence in myself for many years, but for many different reasons. I guess I'd struggled with a sense of self, who I was, what my strengths were, what my place was in this world. I guess because of those own personal struggles, I felt very passionately about the fact that we should all be taken on this journey at a much younger age. You know, it took me, I was 33 when I started my master's. So 33 years of existence and formal studies in psychology to get to any point of realization of this is who I am. These are my strengths. You know, this is my vision. These are my strengths, talents, passions that I can nurture in order to reach that vision. It took me so incredibly long to get there. And I think, you know, it was quite a difficult journey at times, like everyone's journey, you know, nobody has it easy all the time. That I just became very determined that I would like to help people get to that point so much faster, especially people that society had kind of written off or pushed aside in some way, shape or form, because I had a really lucky kind of privileged life, but many people haven't. And yeah, so I guess it was that really, just a deep rooted sense of people could really use this to get ahead so much more quickly and suffer less emotionally and psychologically.
There's similarities actually between myself and yourself there, where I went on and did my degree in psychology when I was like very, very similar age. Yeah. And obviously when you look at psychology, there's so many different approaches, isn't there, that can be taken. Now, you touched on there about the strengths-based approaches, obviously, which is linked to positive psychology. Do you think generally, I suppose, if we're looking at schools and education system right now, do you think children's strengths are played to and spoken about very much?
Not enough, Josh. Yeah, I mean, they're great questions. And I do a lot of work with schools these days, bringing in exactly this strengths-based approach, but it's still very novel. It's still very new. You know, over in Australia, New Zealand, even the States, they've taken this up so much more quickly than over here in the UK. But I still think it's not really a strengths-based approach. You know, we know for human beings, there's something called the negativity bias of the brain. So where there's good and bad in this life, we will always first notice the bad, because it's the bad, in inverted commas, that can endanger our survival emotionally, psychologically, or even physically. Our brains haven't changed in all of these centuries. You know, we still have this bias. And I still think this is very much at play in work, in life, at school, everywhere in the world. So actually training people, young people included, everyone, to notice when they're being hijacked by the negativity bias, to notice when the thoughts they're thinking are making them feel negative emotions, which in turn lead to really disempowered actions and choices. It's that whole thing, isn't it? That every time we think something, we feel something. Because of how we feel, we'll do one thing or we'll do something entirely different. If you can even make young people aware of the fact that cycle exists and is ongoing in our minds, that in and of itself is massively empowering. You know, I think more than happiness, what we need to seek out in this life, it's the freedom from our own negativity. It's the freedom from our disempowering, self-limiting beliefs. You know, once you can get away from the tyranny of your own mind, kind of happiness and liberation and freedom from that, that is the prize as far as I'm concerned. And that's emotional and psychological mastery, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is. And when I think about mental toughness, I think about, like, there's a measure called life control, which is partially to do with your self-worth, your self-esteem. And Peter Clough, who has the 4Cs framework around mental toughness, often talks about a can-do attitude. So really, that's what you're trying to build in people, aren't you? A can-do attitude in their lives, essentially.
Absolutely that, David. But in order to get to that point, you've got to know who you are. How can you be confident as a person if you don't even know who that person is? You know, you've got to go on this introspective journey. And a massive part of that is coming back to what you asked a few minutes ago about strengths. how can you know how can you love who you are without actually knowing what's good about you, what's the best thing about you? And that's why I love the VIA, Values in Action Signature Strand Survey from the University of Pennsylvania. There's a lot of research behind it, but also it's a really easy and fun tool to get a breakdown of what your top strands are. And I would recommend for anybody listening, if you've never done anything like this, it's a very empowering thing to do, because not only does it tell you what your top strengths are, but it likely also shows you what your weaknesses or else points of frustration are too. Because as I'm sure you do a lot of work around this too, a person's top strengths, when overplayed, can be really frustrating. So, my top strength in theory is kindness, which doesn't mean I'm an angel, but it does mean that I don't always know how to say no to people or create appropriate boundaries. And if there's one thing that's tripped me up in this life so far, it's exactly that kind of people pleasing, which doesn't do anybody any good, because we know that when you repress your truth or you repress your emotions, at the same time, you're suppressing your immune system. So over time, this can be problematic, emotionally, psychologically, and physically. So I think coming back to what we're talking about, absolutely, it's important that young people and people of any age get that self-awareness. How do you do that? That's a process. That's a journey. That's asking yourself a series of powerful questions. It's taking strand surveys, getting in touch with your values. All of these things that, unless we explicitly seek this kind of thing out, it's not taught. And that's where I think we're going wrong. I don't know what you think.
I'm having a chuckle inside because around about a month ago, I was pointed towards a study as a participant where I received some coaching, and it was about a strengths-based approach to helping my children deal better with social media, essentially, and with technology, because we have a few issues in this household at times, as do most households.
Yes, I can imagine.
And part of that process was to do the VIA strengths-based assessment. That was the very start. Perspective was my big strength.
Love that, yeah.
Which is fine, but at the same time, as you alluded to, really, with any strength that you have, there is also the downsides too. So that helped me see that. And in terms of where I'm going with this now, what I learned from the short 3 sessions of coaching was how, as a parent, to think about my own strengths, to think about my children's strengths, and then begin to try to play towards them. And as you say, also the things that don't necessarily come easy to me is again recognizing that, and it's so helpful. So what I'm wondering is, obviously you work with a lot of younger people. Do you tend to work with parents and teachers and as well?
Yes, with teachers specifically, yes. So staff would always be the starting point in schools, and then later the young people, because I think it's really important that the people who are leading a school, so we'd usually start with the senior leadership team. And actually, I'm doing exactly that tomorrow. We're taking the team on a journey. It's actually a vision, values, and virtues session. So I think it's really useful, for any team, a corporate team, a school team, any team that work together, to get a sense of what their vision is, what the values that underpin that vision would be, and what are the virtues of every single person on the team that can help bring these values and this vision to life. So absolutely, to working with staff. I haven't yet worked with parents very much, but I think that would be brilliant too, because again, you need people to model this. The power of the psychology that we're talking about, it's not in the theory, it's not in the research, it's in the day-to-day practical application. And I think that's where we see the magic really, really unfold. How can we make these things tangible? When we speak about values and the likes, well, actually, these things mean nothing until they're made tangible and until we can put an action. What is it that's going to bring this value to life? How can we, live in line? For me, David, it's really important to know what your values are. There's a woman I love, Dr. Susan David, and she speaks about the fact that if you know what your values are, every time you need to make a decision, you just simply ask yourself, is what I'm about to think, say, or do going to take me closer or further away from the person I want to be? And it's so simple. It's such a simple question. Yet if you can answer that sincerely every single time, you're always going to move a step forward towards, your fabulous future self. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, that's intriguing when you talk there about the vision and then the values piece there, obviously, and virtues you mentioned there in schools, because there's so many organizations out there where they may have the vision, they may have the values, but it's not actually lived, is it? So I can imagine really the benefits from working with someone like yourself for schools and organizations is going to be so huge.
Thank you. That's really kind. I mean, it's not only about creating a vision for me too, it's about the well-being of the people, the resilience of the people. So tomorrow, as we're creating a vision, we're going to create this vision around 5 things. And this is the central framework to positive psychology from Dr. Martin Seligman. I'm sure you'll be aware. And he says that in order to thrive, human beings need positive emotions, a sense of engagement in their work and life, great relationships, a sense of meaning or purpose, and a sense of accomplishment. And if you get each of those 5 things, you become more resilient. Okay. So when we're creating our vision, we're going to start to think about what each of these 5 things could look like in an optimal setting. Ideally, what could these things look like? And what I found when working with anybody, the simpler we can keep the questions, the more profound the exploration tends to be. So I did some work with government a good few years ago around the time of Brexit. And we just went in and we asked a series of really simple questions based around this model. And the kind of conversations that it evoked, that it catalyzed, were incredible. You'd be amazed at what people have to say about these things. So as I say, tomorrow we will create a vision based around these 5 things. And then we'll go on to say, okay, this is what we've chosen. This is the vision that we've described. What are the values that could underpin this, that could bring this to life? And then again, what are the strengths of each individual and the team collectively that can make all of this happen? Because I think it's really important that each and every person sees how they are tangibly a part of that, because otherwise it's just way too abstract and nonsensical.
Yeah, so I suppose where you're trying to get to would be the key behaviors and key processes that need to be put in place in order for it to actually occur.
Absolutely. It's as simple as, where are we now? Where do we want to be? How can we bridge the gap between the two? And it's that whole thing that if you want human beings to be motivated, they need just 3 things, don't they? They need to feel autonomous in their choices. They need to feel connected to other human beings, and they need to feel as competent as possible. And to me, that autonomy is really, really important. So if you're working with a team, getting them to co-create this vision, it's everything, because then you've got the buy-in, and people are pretty creative. We know, when you induce positive emotions in people, so, curiosity, gratitude, joy, love, excitement, when you're able to give people that little surge of positive emotions, we know that people become more open, more creative, and more collaborative. Both literally and metaphorically, their peripheral vision expands. This experiment you might have heard, 2 groups of people, one group of people watch comedy, the other a sad documentary. They're both then presented with a photograph. The people who watch the comedy literally see the entire picture, whereas the people who watch the sad documentary just have this tunnel vision focusing on the middle of the photograph. And that's because negative emotions give us a tunnel vision so we can see the danger or threat that lies ahead. But if we can get a group of people together, just ask them to share something they're grateful for, excited about, take them away from that negativity bias. You'll quickly induce those positive emotions. And in that setting, again, people are more creative and more collaborative and have more fun. And I think that's the best way to do anything in this life. Prime people positively, give them the autonomy to make their own decisions. And that's where I think the magic really happens.
Yeah, and you mentioned the word fun there. I can imagine the sessions are quite fun, and there'll be a lot of laughter as well. Because, I suppose in some respects, a lot of people look at maybe development days I've got so much on my to-do list, I really could do without this. But as you alluded to, you can make it good fun and then make a lot of progress as well.
Thank you. Absolutely. I mean, I have a great time, and generally I think other people do too. I think sometimes people don't understand that you can have fun and do some really profound work at the same time. Because the nature of the kind of work we do, I think, David, you can create a lovely atmosphere where people become very open and share and really, can share fairly profound insights. But to do that, it takes psychological safety. You've got to create this space where people feel safe to share. And in our world, people are only just starting to be comfortable, I think, after COVID, comfortable about talking about negative emotions, to actually be willing to share. There was so much stigma and shame around that in the past, wasn't there? So actually being able to put words, we know from psychology that whatever you repress will grow stronger. Our freedom comes when we can articulate that which we're thinking and feeling. When you put words to something, you start to make sense of it. When you make sense of it, you can find a solution, find peace, and move on from it. So actually giving people a safe space where they can share. People don't ordinarily get that necessarily in life, in the office. Depending on the boss, the management style, people don't always feel that psychological safety. So bringing everyone together where there is no hierarchy, where everyone's equal, especially in an online session, everybody's the same size of picture. Nobody's sitting, at the head of the table. That really democratizes the experience, which I think is really important here. And with a series of simple questions in a psychologically safe space, I truly believe something quite magical can happen.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. I know in the last 12 months or so, I've done some work in sporting environments where often there's a bit of a fear culture, essentially, because people are like playing for their places and things like that, and maybe the language used is a bit choice at times. And some of the most powerful sessions they haven't really been sort of related to the sport. They're just, as you say, just going out for a stroll, talking about different things they're grateful for. Other things we did was, it was a little exercise where could you just write down some strengths about the person to the right of you, to the left of you, and people came out of the room with a big smile on their face, and they were in a pretty crappy situation at the time as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, there is such a big place for that, as you say, and then it helps. I think it helps the environment, doesn't it? And that team element, if you like.
Massively. Thank you. I can really relate to exactly what you're describing, and I do something similar with some of my staff. Team building days, we would do the strengths shower where very much, as you say, I actually have a set of strengths cards, and every individual has to go around the room handing out one strengths card to another person. But they don't just hand them the card. They tell them when they've seen this strength in action and what difference it's made to them or to other human beings. And like you, I've seen some really pretty profound reactions to this, like people becoming quite tearful and saying, wow, I've never been told this. Thank you for noticing. Because all too often, we go through our busy, chaotic lives without taking a second to acknowledge that which we see and feel around us that's good about other human beings, but we don't give that feedback. And the more we can identify what's good about a person, the more that person becomes aware that this strength exists and can look for new ways to use this strength, ways to develop this strength. Because I'd be really keen to hear what you think from your sports psychology background, David. But it's this idea in positive psychology that excellence does not come through just rectifying weakness, if not enhancing strengths to the max. I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, certainly from the sporting context, I noticed generally it is a case of like pulling people up on things they didn't do well. The word weak and weakness is used too much in my eyes. I despise the word.
Yeah, I know.
I suppose it's a challenge with this podcast, and it's something that I set out 3 years ago with the podcast. Obviously, you've got mental toughness. So many people see the opposite of mental toughness as mental weakness. So yeah, I set out to demystify that one. So this podcast adds to that. So yeah, thank you. Now I'm going off on a tangent.
Not at all.
But yeah, there is so much time and effort, energy, negative emotions spent on the things that people need to really work hard at. Where actually, if you look at the research out there, and if you think about it, if you help someone play to their strengths, you can get some quick wins from that, can't you? And really evoke some confidence and some, as I say, quick changes in them, in my work, their performance levels can improve, and how they relate to other people, and I suppose some of the other five things that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, massively. And I think you hit on something there in the fact it is all about these minor tweaks, change is incremental, improvement is very incremental, isn't it? But if on a daily basis, we can implement some small habits that lead us towards this place of improved well-being, improved performance. There's a guy called Joe Dispenza who's been a little bit controversial, but he claims that by the time we're 35 years old, I think it is, around 90% of who we are is based on habits that we created in the past. So based on thoughts, feelings, and actions from the past. And I think whether you love this guy or hate this guy, that we have to accept there's real truth to the fact that much of what we do in the present is determined by our past. So if we've got a fabulous, perfect life, we might not need to look at our thought, emotion, behavior cycles. But if we do want to make some changes, we perhaps do have to challenge some of our thinking and the emotions that thinking makes us feel, and some of the actions we're taking. Because I don't know whether you'll agree with me here, David, but I think it's much easier to change or to challenge your thoughts and your actions rather than to instantly change your emotional state, right?
No, I completely agree there. And a question I like to ask someone, and again, I'll go to the sporting context, would be if they had a competitive event at the weekend, it would be, what is success to you? And 99% of the time, the answer is, it's to win. Okay, fine, great. But then, as you say, if you can then break that down into, well, okay, so what is winning all about here? What do you think to win? What do you behave like? What do you actually feel emotionally when you win? And then stripping it back to the key behaviors and processes around that, then you're not going to go too far wrong.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And for me, rather than just a series of victories, I guess for me, the sense of progress or progression is more important from my perspective. I'd be interested to hear what you think. But we know from psychology, there's something called hedonic adaptation, which means that sooner or later, human beings get used to everything, both the good and the bad, which is really useful when it comes to adversity and difficult situations. But not quite so good when it comes to victories, because it means that goals that we strive for don't tend to satisfy us for all that long. So maybe what we should be aiming for is a feeling of continual improvement in every aspect of life. I'd love to know from your background how that sits with you.
Yeah, no, I agree. I certainly in sport, but in general life, I think you find people don't take the time out, do they, to maybe look to reflect on occasions and learn from the successes, often from their failures as well, and they just get in a cycle of do. So, as you alluded to earlier, asking damn good questions of yourself is a good starting point, which is probably a nice way to start to wrap this up. Could you just share with the listeners, I suppose, one of the best questions that you like to ask your clients?
One of the best questions I like to ask people, I guess one of the questions that I really love comes from a quote from Abraham Maslow. Now, let me get this quote right. I think he says that at any given moment in life, we have two choices. We either step forwards into growth or backwards into safety. So as simple as the question is, I would like to ask people when they're about to make a decision, Is this going to take you closer to who you want to be or further away, quite simply? But because for me, the choice should always be growth, even where there's discomfort and fear. I think this idea of failing forwards is so incredibly important. You mentioned earlier that there's so much learning that comes through things not going quite so well. So as simple and almost simplistic as it sounds, I like to know, hang on, is this decision taking you into growth or back into the comfort zone? Because the comfort zone, it can be so hard to know. We're so used to being in that space. It's this idea that if something doesn't make you feel a little bit afraid from time to time, are you actually growing? Are you evolving? How can we reframe this fear as excitement? I'm doing some public speaking in person in the very near future, and I haven't done it really since pre-COVID times. And I'm terrified, but it's what can I do to reframe that as just excitement? Because something matters here. I think when we feel that fear, we've got to remind ourselves, there's something that I prize here, that I treasure, that's important to me. And that's a great thing. And it's only right that I feel slightly afraid, because there is something on the line here. But at the same time, failing forwards, this concept is so important. Every time we learn, we grow. The brain is wired for continual growth, isn't it? It's that whole expression, neurons that fire together, wire together. Every time we do something, say something, think something, the next time it's faster, it's easier, it's more automatic. So human beings can constantly grow and evolve. So I think if there's one question I'd like to leave your listeners with, it's that question from Maslow. Am I stepping forwards into growth or backwards into safety?
I love that. That's a fantastic question to ask yourself. And could you also share with the listeners 3 key takeaways from our conversation today as well, which I've thoroughly enjoyed?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I guess if there were 3 things I'd love you to think about or to remember, the first one would be the negativity bias, in the sense that please be aware at any given moment in life, the negativity bias could hijack you. Remember that where there's good and bad, you will first focus on the bad. By being aware that this exists, you can catch yourself. You can almost have a little alarm sounding in your mind. This is what I do. I don't know if that means I'm quite strange, but I almost see and hear a flashing alarm saying, potential hijack, negativity bias. Is this a real threat, or is this my brain doing what it's evolved to do, which is to protect me from danger? Is this a real threat or just a perceived threat? Because oftentimes it's just your brain trying to keep you in the comfort zone. So once you've mastered the negativity bias, I would say the next step is beginning to create a bit of a vision of where you want to go in your life. And once again, I'd love for your listeners to take a peek at the PERMA model and think about the ways in which they can get more positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning and accomplishment in their lives. There's a really, really lovely exercise that you can do this with, and that's with Dr. Laura King's Best Possible Future Self exercise. If you Google this, you'll find a way, and it talks you through creating your future vision. If you create that vision around the PERMA model, I don't think you'll go far wrong. And the final thing that I'd love to share is, so when you've overcome that negativity bias, you have a sense of a vision of where you'd like to go, what are your unique strengths that will make all of this happen? And that's when I would really recommend taking the VIA, the Values in Action Signature Strengths Survey from the University of Pennsylvania, which you can do for free. You just need to sign up with an email address. So those would be my 3 takeaways.
Fabulous, Lisa. That's great. And yeah, I'm sure the listeners will get an awful lot from this podcast episode. So yeah, big thank you for your time today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure and honor. So thank you.
So following on from Lisa's excellent insights, I'd like you to ask yourself some really, really important questions. Now, if you're a leader, a coach, or a parent, I'm wondering, how much focus do you actually spend on the strengths of those around you? Or do you look for their problems or weaknesses instead and point them out? Give that a little bit of thought. And what I'm actually going to do as well, I'm going to pop a little link in the show notes to a very short free questionnaire. And this is for parents, but you can maybe change the wording if you like in your own mind if you're a coach or a leader. And it's going to help you with this exercise. So that the link goes to a website called leewaters.com. So more on the questions. So when we think about this positive focus, do you think you spend 30, 40, 50, 60% of the time focusing on the good parts in other people, or less? Perhaps maybe your own stressors, personal or work-orientated stressors, get in the way. Or is it your belief to simply focus on negatives, maybe to try and improve people? Or, we've talked about the negativity trap. Maybe your brain automatically points you towards looking at the negatives, and you've never really given it any thought. Now, if you do spend 70% of your time encouraging kids, colleagues, or players to work on their strengths, to improve their strengths, how do you think they would feel? Lighter, I would think. Certainly lighter than always working on their weaknesses. And I would imagine they would feel a bit better as well than always being pointed towards the things that don't come natural to them. They're likely to feel more valued and respected as a result, which goes on to link to this whole life control and can-do attitude and self-esteem, essentially. That feeling of self-worth, feeling that you're good enough. So yeah, some food for thought and something I hope that you found very useful. You might also want to check out the Mental Edge regular newsletters that I publish, which again have a heap of resources to help you with this type of thing. Have a fantastic week and a big thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed this episode of the Demystifying Mental Toughness Podcast with David Charlton, do check out my website, sport-excellence.co.uk, and my online sports psychology resources. The Sport-Excellence website has essential resources for anyone looking to build their own mental toughness or the mental toughness of their athletes or teams, or if you want to achieve peak performance more often or optimal functioning. The Sport Excellence website has everything you need to keep moving forward and thrive. So go on, head over to sport-excellence.co.uk to find out more.